They call it the Texas Killing Fields. A strip of land so ordinary, so unremarkable, that if you drove past it on a warm Texas afternoon, you'd see nothing more than marsh grass, scrub trees, and an endless horizon cut by the shimmer of heat. But beneath the soil of this corridor, stretching along Interstate 45 between Houston and Galveston, lay secrets so dark that the name itself has become synonymous with terror. From the 1970s to the 1990s, this land became a graveyard. More than 30 young women and girls were murdered here, their bodies scattered across abandoned fields, drainage ditches, and the skeletal remains of old oil industry land. They were daughters, sisters, friends, ordinary people who disappeared without a trace, only to be found months later under the unforgiving Texas sun. Think about that number, 30 confirmed victims. And then think about the chilling possibility, because investigators have long suspected that the true number is higher. Perhaps dozens more. Their remains never recovered, their names never added to the grim tally. For decades, the FBI, local sheriffs, and Texas Rangers poured resources into this mystery. The investigations cost millions. And yet, many of the cases remain unsolved. A haunting reminder of how even the most determined pursuit of justice can run dry when evil hides in plain sight. The story begins with a simple truth. This was a perfect hunting ground. The I-45 corridor was a restless artery of America in the 1970s. The oil industry boomed in Houston, while Galveston offered beaches, nightlife, and escape. Hitchhiking was common. Runaways drifted through bus stations. The highway was busy enough to swallow people whole, but remote enough to keep dark secrets hidden. The fields themselves, swampy, desolate, difficult to patrol, were almost designed for predators. Once a girl disappeared, the chances of finding her alive were slim. Imagine being a parent in those days. One moment your daughter is headed to the convenience store, or walking to a party, or catching a ride with a friend. The next moment she's gone. And the police, overwhelmed with cases, too often dismissed the reports as runaways. She'd come back, they would say. Teenagers leave all the time. But in these cases, they didn't come back. They never would. By the late 1970s, whispers spread among locals. Mothers warned daughters not to hitchhike. Fathers patrolled their neighborhoods, watching for strangers. Still, the disappearances continued. And when the bodies began to be discovered, often naked, strangled, left to rot in shallow ground, the horror revealed itself in full. The press gave it a name that would stick forever. The Texas Killing Fields. This was not one killer, not one investigation, not one neat narrative with a beginning and end. This was decades of terror, overlapping cases, and predators who saw opportunity in a land that seemed cursed. Some would be caught. Many would not. Tonight, we step into those fields. We walk that highway. And we try to understand how so many could vanish in one place, under the gaze of an entire state. But before we begin, I want to remind you, this is Mr. True Death. Here, we explore the darkest corners of history, the places most people dare not look. If you want to keep facing these shadows with me, hit subscribe. Join the community that refuses to turn away from the truths that still haunt us. Because the Texas Killing Fields is not just a story about crime. It's about geography, opportunity, and silence. It's about how evil can thrive when no one believes it could happen here. And it starts in the early 1970s with the first missing girls, whose names would be etched into this grim history. The first bodies appeared almost quietly, as if the land itself was whispering what was coming. In 1971, a 14-year-old girl named Brenda Jones left her Galveston home to visit a sick relative in the hospital. She never arrived. Days later, her body was pulled from Galveston Bay. Her life ended in violence no teenager should ever face. Not long after, another girl, Colette Wilson, just 13 years old, vanished while walking home from her summer band camp in Alvin, Texas. Weeks later, her remains were discovered near a reservoir, discarded like trash in a landscape meant to hide her forever. One case might have been written off as a tragic fluke, the kind of senseless violence that could strike anywhere. But 2, 3, 4. By the early 1970s, the disappearances were stacking up, like beads on a necklace strung with grief. At first, police reports treated many of these girls as runaways. That was the era's cruel. If a teenage girl went missing, surely she'd just taken off, chasing adventure, rebelling against strict parents. But the truth was darker. These weren't young rebels disappearing into the night. These were children being stolen, abducted, assaulted, and murdered. And then came the discovery that would shift everything. In 1971, two teenage girls, Debbie Ackerman and Maria Johnson, both just 15, disappeared after hitchhiking near Galveston. Their bodies were found floating in Turner's Bayou. The brutality was undeniable. Locals realized this wasn't coincidence, wasn't teenage rebellion. This was predation. Still, law enforcement was slow to act. The Houston-Galveston corridor was exploding with growth. Houston's population soared. Crime spiked. Police were stretched thin. And the missing girls, most of them from working-class families, rarely made headlines beyond the local paper. Their faces showed up on posters in diners, on church bulletin boards, on the walls of gas stations. But outside their families, there was silence. Imagine the fear creeping in at that time. You're a parent, watching the news, seeing that another girl has gone missing not 20 miles from your home. You warn your daughter, don't hitchhike, don't walk alone, don't trust strangers. But you also know the truth. Even the most careful girls were, and the geographer played its part. The stretch of Interstate 45 was both busy and isolating. Thousands of cars roared past every day, but once you stepped off the highway, you were surrounded by oil refineries, swamps, and forgotten fields. It was land carved up by industry and left unattended. A no man's land, where bodies could vanish for months, even years, before being found. The whispers became louder. Someone was hunting along I-45. Maybe not just one someone. The cases carried eerie similarities. Young women, abducted near the highway, often found in water or fields, stripped of clothing, murdered with quiet, brutal efficiency. By 1973, the disappearances had become impossible to ignore. Parents banded together, demanding answers. Some drove the highways themselves at night, scanning the fields with flashlights, desperate to find a clue the police had missed. They didn't trust the authorities to solve it anymore. And as the years passed, more names were added to the list. Rhonda Johnson, Sharon Shaw, Kimberly Pitwood. Each story almost identical. The sudden disappearance, the agonizing wait, and the devastating discovery. One case might be random, two might be coincidence. But by the mid-1970s, this stretch of land had become something else entirely. A hunting ground. The first discoveries were no longer isolated tragedies. They were the opening chapter of what would become one of the most infamous unsolved mysteries in Texas history. And as the 1980s began, the fields themselves would earn a name that no one could forget. By the late 1970s, the mystery along I-45 had grown too big, too bloody, to be ignored. Families had been pleading, mothers begging police to take their daughters' cases seriously. And yet the bodies kept appearing. Fields that once looked like empty stretches of Texas prairie now carried a new weight. To the locals, they weren't just fields anymore, they were graveyards. The land near League City became the center of whispers. Hunters stumbled across bones while chasing deer. Oil workers found shallow graves near abandoned equipment. Kids exploring the countryside made discoveries that would scar them for life. These weren't isolated patches of dirt anymore. They were connected by tragedy, and the community gave it a name: the Killing Fields. The phrase started as a whisper, then appeared in the newspapers, then echoed across television broadcasts. Once spoken, it stuck like tar. There was no going back. This was no longer just about missing girls, it was about a cursed geography. A place where predators operated freely, knowing the land would hide their crimes. Imagine the psychological impact. League City, Dickinson, Galveston, small towns nestled along the Gulf Coast, suddenly bore the weight of a horror story. Parents refused to let their daughters walk to school. Teenagers stopped hitchhiking entirely. The once carefree nights of cruising down the highway became tinged with fear. Even the police admitted, quietly, that they might not be dealing with one killer, but several. And the fields themselves seemed to conspire against investigators. The soil was marshy, the heat relentless, animals quick to disturb human remains. By the time bodies were discovered, months, sometimes years had passed. Evidence had rotted away. Fingerprints, fibers, footprints, all erased by the swamp and the sun. Each discovery raised more questions than answers. The victims shared patterns. Most were teenage girls or young women. Many last seen near convenience stores, laundromats, or while hitchhiking along the highway. Some were runaways, yes, but not all. The randomness made it worse. It wasn't just one type of girl who was at risk. It was any girl. Families, already devastated, began forming their own networks. Support groups sprouted, where parents shared information and leads, desperate for any connection that could bring closure. They kept binders of clippings, drove endless miles retracing last steps, harassed police departments to reopen cold cases. It was grief turned into obsession. The media, always hungry for a story that could shock, latched onto the term killing fields. Photographs of missing girls were plastered beside wide shots of lonely Texas prairies, a visual contrast that hammered home the horror. Innocence swallowed by emptiness. Television crews arrived to film the windswept grass, narrating how dozens of women had disappeared here, as if the land itself was cursed. But the reality was more terrifying than curses or superstition. It was human. Predators had discovered the perfect environment. The highway offered access. The fields offered concealment. The lack of coordination between local law enforcement agencies scattered jurisdictions. Rivalries and outdated methods meant killers could strike again and again without being caught. By the early 1980s, the Texas killing fields weren't just a local tragedy. They were becoming a national symbol of law enforcement failure, of society's blind spot for vulnerable women, and of the kind of evil that thrives in silence. And yet, as haunting as the phrase killing fields was, it still didn't capture the whole truth. Because this wasn't a single mystery. This wasn't a single monster. It was a stage, and multiple killers were playing out their nightmares on it. And as the next decade unfolded, the shadows would only deepen. By the 1980s, the Texas killing fields had claimed so many lives that investigators could no longer deny the pattern. Each new discovery added to a grim puzzle. Young females last seen alive near the I-45 corridor, often abducted while walking, hitchhiking, or making short trips. Most were teenagers. Most were killed by strangulation. Many were stripped of clothing, their bodies discarded with chilling indifference. But the question that haunted every detective was this: was it one killer or many? Some investigators argued there had to be a single predator, someone who knew the fields intimately and operated with confidence. Others believed the geography itself attracted opportunistic predators, multiple killers, drawn to the same stretch of land because it was the perfect dumping ground. That debate has never been fully resolved, even decades later. What's clear is that suspects began to emerge. Some of them were already monsters with criminal records. Michael Lloyd Self, a mechanic from Galveston, was convicted for the murders of two teenage girls, Rhonda Johnson and Sharon Shaw, in 1975. But doubts surrounded his conviction. Critics argued his confession was coerced, and evidence didn't fully match. Was he truly guilty, or just a convenient scapegoat? Then came other names, darker ones. Edward Harold Bell, a drifter with a violent past, later confessed to killing 11 young girls in the Houston Galveston area. He called them the 11 who went to heaven. Yet many of his confessions were riddled with inconsistencies. Was Bell bragging to inflate his own infamy, or was he one of the shadows who stalked the fields? And then there was William Lewis Reece, a smooth-talking laborer who seemed ordinary enough. Until the 1990s, when DNA evidence linked him to multiple abductions and murders. The truth was dawning on investigators. The Texas killing fields were not the work of a single hand. This was a hunting ground exploited by multiple killers over decades. A tragic overlap of evil, geography, and opportunity. And yet, the chaos of law enforcement made things worse. Different counties, different police departments, all working their own cases, often with no communication between them. Evidence slipped through cracks. Leads went cold. Families were left in limbo. For the public, the terror only deepened. It was one thing to imagine one madman haunting the highways. It was another to accept that there could be several. That at any moment, a different predator might be watching, waiting for a girl walking alone. The shadows of the Texas killing fields weren't just made of marsh grass and oil rigs. They were made of faces, men who looked like neighbors, mechanics, workers, men who blended in, unnoticed, while they hunted. And as those shadows grew, the grief of the families reached a breaking point. Behind every missing poster, every headline, Every whispered rumor along the I-45 corridor was a family living in agony. While police debated suspects and jurisdictions argued over evidence, parents were left staring at empty bedrooms, clutching photographs that were beginning to yellow at the edges. For them, the Texas killing fields weren't a news story. They were a wound that never closed. Take the mother who left her porch light on for 10 years, convinced her daughter might still walk through the front door, or the father who drove the same stretch of highway night after night, scanning the roadside ditches with a flashlight, certain he'd catch a glint of something: a shoe, a bracelet, any trace of the child he lost. The cruelty wasn't just in the murders themselves. It was in the silence that followed. Many parents felt abandoned by law enforcement. They would call, beg for updates, only to be told there was nothing new, nothing more that could be done. Some cases sat in file cabinets for years without progress. To the families, it felt like their daughters had been forgotten by everyone except them. So they took matters into their own hands. Mothers organized vigils, creating networks where they shared leads and tips, hoping to connect dots the police had missed. Fathers stomped through brush and swamps, searching fields when the authorities stopped looking. Families turned grief into obsession, because doing nothing felt worse than despair. And through it all, the media alternated between brief flashes of attention and long stretches of silence. The faces of missing girls would appear on the evening news, then vanish, replaced by fresher stories. But the parents never stopped. They couldn't. Each day without answers was another knife twist. One mother, speaking to a reporter years later, said, "When your child is missing, you never stop hearing her voice. You never stop seeing her face. She's with you when you wake up, when you fall asleep, when you breathe. The police may close the case, but for us, it never closes." This was the hidden cost of the Texas killing fields. Not just the bodies left in the marsh, but the families left to wander through a different kind of wasteland. A wasteland of unanswered questions. Even the rituals of grief were stolen from them. For some families, it took years to find remains. Others never received that closure at all. Imagine trying to mourn without a body. Imagine holding a funeral for a daughter when the coffin is empty, filled only with photographs and flowers. And yet, despite the devastation, some families became relentless advocates. They pushed for more resources, demanded task forces, refused to let the names of their daughters fade into the shadows. Without them, many of these cases would have been forgotten entirely. Their grief became the engine that kept the investigation alive, year after year. The agony of the families is the part of the story that rarely makes it into the headlines. But it is the part that defines the killing fields more than anything else. Because the monsters who stalked that highway didn't just kill their victims, they destroyed entire lives, entire generations, leaving scars that can never heal. And while families were fighting for answers, the killings didn't stop. The 1990s would bring new horror, new victims, and new headlines that proved the fields weren't finished claiming lives. By the dawn of the 1990s, many in Texas hoped the nightmare of the killing fields was fading. Some believed the predators of the 1970s and 1980s had either been caught, died, or moved on. But the land along I-45 was not finished. The fields would open their jaws once again. In 1991, a chilling discovery shocked League City. In a single patch of land, an abandoned field off Calder Road, police uncovered not one, not two, but 4 sets of human remains. 4 women, buried within a few hundred yards of one another. Some had been missing for years, others more recently. One woman, identified as Laura Miller, was just 16 years old when she disappeared in 1984. Her father, Tim Miller, had begged the police for years to search that very field. When her remains were finally found, his grief turned into fury that would fuel his lifelong crusade to fight for victims and their families. That discovery turned Calder Road into the heart of the killing fields legend. The image was too stark, too horrifying. 4 shallow graves clustered together like a hunter's trophies. Forensic teams combed through the soil, searching for fibers, hairs, any scrap of evidence. But the Texas heat and time had destroyed almost everything. What was left were bones, questions, and a sense of dread that the killer or killers were still out there. And the murders didn't stop. In 1996, 19-year-old Tiffany Johnston vanished in Oklahoma. She was later linked to William Reece, the same man tied to several disappearances along the I-45 corridor. In 1997, 12-year-old Laura Smither disappeared while jogging near her home in Friendswood. Her body was found 17 days later in a retention pond. The community's heartbreak was overwhelming. Vigils turned into protests. People asked the same question over and over. How could this keep happening? By the mid-1990s, the Texas killing fields were no longer a local horror story. They were a national obsession. Newspapers across the country ran headlines about the highway of death. Television crews returned, filming wide shots of the lonely grasslands and oil derricks, narrating how dozens of young women had vanished here, almost as if the earth itself demanded sacrifice. The FBI became more deeply involved, pouring resources into a task force. Criminal profilers studied the cases, mapping out patterns and searching for links. They admitted something chilling. It was unlikely one man was responsible. Instead, the fields had become a magnet. Multiple predators, working independently, using the 1990s didn't close the book on the killing fields. They opened a darker chapter, one that revealed just how vast, how tangled, and how terrifying the mystery really was. And as technology advanced DNA testing, new forensic techniques, hope flickered that answers might finally come. But every revelation only raised more disturbing questions. Because if the 1990s taught Texas anything, it was this. The fields were not haunted by the ghost of one killer. They were haunted by the reality of many. As the new millennium approached, science began to offer something that the families of the Texas killing fields had been denied for decades. Hope. DNA analysis, once primitive and unreliable, had matured into a powerful tool. For the first time, evidence that had sat useless in dusty boxes could be tested again. And slowly, names began to surface. One of the most infamous was William Lewis Reece, a construction worker with an unassuming face. Reece might have passed for a neighbor, a co-worker, a man you wouldn't think twice about. But in 1997, he was arrested for the kidnapping and attempted murder of a young woman in Oklahoma who managed to escape. Years later, DNA would tie him to multiple killings along the I-45 corridor. In 2016, Reece led investigators to the remains of several victims, including 17-year-old Jessica Kane, who had been missing for nearly 2 decades. He eventually confessed to killing at least 4 women, yet even as Reece's confessions brought closure to some families, they deepened the mystery. Because the victims could never explain the dozens of bodies that had been found in the fields since the 1970s. Reece was a predator, yes, but he was not the predator. Another suspect loomed in the background. Clyde Hedrick, a convicted sex offender who lived near the fields during the 1980s. He was tied to the death of Ellen Beason, a woman found dead near League City in 1984. Hedrick's reputation was that of a violent drifter, and some investigators believe he was responsible for more than one of the unsolved murders. But direct evidence tying him to the other killings was thin, and many of the cases around him remained unsolved. Then there was Edward Harold Bell, a man whose name sent shivers through investigators. Arrested in 1992 for the murder of a man who had confronted him about indecent exposure. Bell later claimed from prison that he was responsible for what he called the 11 who went to heaven, young girls murdered in the Houston Galveston area in the 1970s. His chilling confessions seemed to fit, but Bell was notorious for exaggerations, and law enforcement struggled to separate fact from delusion. Was he telling the truth, or simply seizing the spotlight from his cell? What became clear was that the Texas killing fields were never the work of a single mind. They were a tragic intersection where multiple killers converged across decades. Each predator operated independently, yet together. They transformed a stretch of Texas prairie into one of the most infamous hunting grounds in America. Theories began to circulate, some plausible, others terrifying. Was there a trafficking ring operating along I-45, preying on vulnerable girls and discarding them in the fields when they became a liability? Was the highway itself, with its endless flow of strangers, simply a magnet for predators who could vanish into the stream of cars, faceless and untraceable? For families, the uncertainty was unbearable. Some gained closure through DNA matches. Their daughters' remains identified at last. But closure is a cruel word in this context. It meant the nightmare was confirmed. It was no longer hope, but grief carved in stone. For others, there was no ending at all. Their daughters remained missing, their names still etched into posters and prayer circles. The mystery of who took the man, why still unanswered. And so, even with breakthroughs, even with science pulling secrets from bone and soil. The Texas killing fields remained what they had always been, an unfinished puzzle, a story without a final chapter. But one truth could no longer be denied. The legend of the fields had already outlived the killers themselves. It had become something larger, something that defined an entire region of Texas. And it left behind a legacy that still lingers in the minds of anyone who dares to drive that stretch of highway. Today, if you drive down Interstate 45 between Houston and Galveston, you'll see the same fields that terrified generations before. Tall grass sways in the Gulf breeze. Rusted oil tanks dot the horizon. Subdivisions have crept closer, the modern world pushing against the edges of the old wilderness. But the shadows remain. People still call it the Texas killing fields. It is more than just a location. Now it is a legend, a warning, a scar carved into Texas history. Over the decades, more than 30 women and girls were murdered along this corridor. Some killers were caught, some confessed, others slipped away into the fog of history. But many of the cases remain unsolved. Families are still waiting. Mothers still light candles on anniversaries. Fathers still carry photographs in their wallets, faces frozen in time from the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. The FBI has said outright what investigators once whispered. This was not the work of a single monster. It was the perfect storm of geography and opportunity, a hunting ground exploited by many predators across decades. That truth is perhaps the most chilling of all, because it means the killing fields were never about one evil man. They were about the possibility of evil itself, how it can spread, multiply, and thrive when given the right conditions. The story has been told in books, documentaries, even dramatized in films. Yet no retelling ever fully captures the silence of those fields, the weight of walking through land where so many lives ended. To stand there is to feel a presence, not supernatural, but human. The presence of choices made in cruelty, of crimes committed with cold calculation. And so the legacy of the Texas killing fields is twofold. It is a testament to the families who never gave up, who forced authorities to